That's good. Sure. Okay. Okay. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
Awesome. So since we've kind of like been a little up and down in terms of attendance and so on, I'll start by giving a little bit of a review of some of the stuff that we covered. So I'm going to start over here with a definition of what we defined yoga to be. So yoga comes from the word yuj, which means to unite. And the purpose is to unite the body, the mind, and the spirit in the state of harmony and balance. And really, the nature of Hinduism, Hindu philosophy at its core, is trying to find pathways to this unity. So, this ultimate unity where you've realized your true nature, that you're not your mind, you're not your body, you're not what you identify with. That is kind of you could say, the overarching purpose. And that's what we've defined to be as yoga. And so in that thing, then yoga is kind of basically pathways to that ultimate unity. Now, the structure of this course, we were going to be talking about four different types of yoga, the four core ones. And all four of them are discussed in the Bhagavad Gita, which you could consider to be our core text. So it starts off with karma yoga, which is dealing with action, consequences, and all of that. We have Bhakti Yoga, which is basically devotion. We have Raja Yoga, which is the path of meditation. And then we have Gyan Yoga, which is the path of knowledge. So technically, by being part of this class, we are embarking in Gyan Yoga. Beyond that, we are obviously, there is some element of bhakti involved in all of that too, and we'll be meditating. So we'll kind of get like a little bit of a good glimpse of everything. So in this, we started off by talking about why we should act and why not just meditate and renounce basically everything. And that's where we started off by bringing up the concept of dharma. So the idea is that if everyone were to just sit down and meditate and just focus solely on the internal journey while completely disregarding the external, then society in and of itself would be in disarray. And that would be, if you think about it, a form of violence, right? Because that would be harming different people, where would we get our food from? All of these different things would kind of be in consideration. So in this, we kind of needed a pathway to have a balance between just renouncing everything while also kind of maintaining our responsibilities. And that's where dharma kind of comes in, right? And it's kind of essentially, if you want to think about it, it's the cosmic order of the universe is what it's kind of considered. And the interesting thing over here is that another word for Hinduism or the Vedic religion is essentially Sanatan Dharma, which is universal dharma. So this religion of Hinduism is also very concerned with kind of finding that balance between both of them based off of what your role in society is and so on. Now, the interesting thing about dharma is that it's very ambiguous, right? And we've had entire epics and all these poems and stories written about it, like the Mahabharata or Ramayana, just to kind of describe and give a better explanation of what dharma really is. And even then, there's like all these kind of like messy conundrums with dharma, right? That has a term for, we call them dharam sankats, which basically are moral dilemmas. So that's kind of a very important concept in Hinduism as well. Now, breaking down dharma, we have Sanatan Dharma. And by the way, you don't need to remember all these terminology. That's just kind of me giving it as a means of kind of giving you a complete picture. But the core thing is just understanding what you may from the concepts itself. So Sanatan Dharma is basically the eternal universal principles. It's things that are kind of core to everybody, right? It's everyone at all time. It's in a sense a responsibility to uphold these things. So your truth, nonviolence, all those core principles of humanity that keeps us together, right? That would come under Sanatan Dharma. And then Swadharma, which is kind of like your own personal duty. And this is a little bit more circumstantial in nature. And then there's also where both of these kind of interrelate and when does one take priority over the other. But your personal duty may be, say you're a student, then it would be towards studying, acquiring knowledge, training yourself for the workforce, and so on. And like there's like roles of society, people that are in your life, your natural aptitudes, and they all kind of come into play when you're figuring out what your swadharma is. So we talked about why it isn't so clearly defined just right now, where there's like all these different factors that kind of come at play, and they're not the same for everyone. So like having just one rule book where it's like if you are this, you should do this. If you are this, you should do this. Is like doesn't necessarily work because everyone's circumstances are different. Now, in the Vedic tradition, we had this concept over here of ashramas, and ashramas are basically stages of life, and it's kind of dealing with that whole balance thing that we were talking about earlier, where because if everyone just like quit and retired into the mountains, there'd be no balance for society to function. But then if people were just purely fixated on the material side of things, there would be no spiritual growth. So this is kind of a balance between two. So it starts off with the student stage where you focus on your education, develop morals, prepare for all your future responsibilities. At when you become about like 25 years old, roughly, that's the householder stage where you have kids, you get married, you accumulate wealth, you contribute to society, and you start learning a little bit more about like the religious side of things, the spiritual side of things. You start meditating, you do all these things that like at a base level. Then when you reach like the retirement stage, when you're in your 50s and maybe so on, and again, these age ranges are a little bit circumstantial as well, right? It depends what position you are in society, how quickly you can reach these stages. So it's different for everyone. But that's when you kind of start to like let go of your household responsibilities, and then you kind of start to withdraw from the worldly life. And what that means is you start spending more time in doing spiritual things, giving back to the community, um, and doing all these things that are kind of like just meant for society as a whole. And then the final stage, which is roughly above 75 years and older, is when you're focusing purely on spiritual liberation and then also passing that knowledge on to other people. So going from the student stage all the way down to the renunciation stage, you start to have like greater and greater amount of time that you're spending on basically the spiritual side of things while you're reducing the amount of time generally that you're spending on worldly things, and that means like that includes doing like your job and all these other things. So all those like worldly responsibilities start to reduce over a period of time. Now we kind of ended off by talking about karma and we introduced a concept. So karma being the law of cause and effect. So there's three parts that this can be broken down into. And I know people have a lot of impressions when it comes to karma, right? It's just like, oh, karma is that like if you do something bad, something bad's gonna happen to you, right? And that's basically it. Or like that classic thing that oh, karma is a bitch. But it's really a lot more than that. So there's three parts, as I mentioned. There's like the action itself, and even action over here is it can be a physical thing, it could be a mental thing, it could be a verbal thing. So it just doesn't need to be a decision that you make. It could be even a thought that you have, and it could be just a something that you might say. So all these things are considered actions under the concept of karma, and they have influences, consequences, which is what is called phal, and that's kind of the outcome of your action. Now, naturally, as humans, we try to like connect things together and see that this action led to this and so on. But there's a lot of unintended consequences that come as a result of an action as well. And the final step or the final part of karma is your intention, right? So that's what essentially dictates the quality of your action, the moral quality of your action. It's like you can do the same action, but have two very different intentions. And as a result, they will be under the Hindu framework of karma, be kind of understood very differently. So imagine you're giving back to society. Like let's say you're working in an NGO or some sort of charity. But the purpose of you doing that is kind of like a social status thing, that you're doing it so people can know that you're doing it and think that, oh, like you're such a good person. Then that intention is very different than, oh, there's a genuine problem in society and I want to contribute and give back. So the intention has a very heavy weight when it comes to karma and the consequences of your action. So this is kind of an interesting concept now, that in Hinduism, the goal isn't to accumulate a lot of good karma. The goal is actually to have no karma. So I'm going to kind of open that up just to have a quick discussion for the people, especially that weren't here before. Why do you think that the purpose is not to have good karma, but to have no karma?
I have a guess, but I'm not honestly really sure.
Huh?
So I was thinking maybe because as you accumulate, whether it's a good karma or bad karma, you're basically accumulating actions that bind you to a worldly living or a worldly life. While if you're accumulating no karma, you're basically detaching yourself from like worldly behaviors. So you like in an attempt to reach salvation, essentially, you'd want to be as loosely tied to the world as possible. That's my guess.
Yeah. Anna, that's perfect. Anna, go ahead.
Hey, more of a question than an answer, but when we say we want no karma, are we saying that we want like a net zero where all of your good karma balances with your bad, or are we saying that we don't want any karma?
I think in this, it's that it kind of boils down to nothing. So not that the good and the bad cancel each other out, because
Yeah,
that's kind of like it's kind of like swinging, right? Then keep on going up and down, kind of like the pendulum. So it's like
yeah.
the nature of like rather than saying that, oh, we want the pendulum like net to be zero, it's like we want like the how much the pendulum is traveling back and forth to reduce and reduce over time, and then eventually become nothing.
How can you have an action that produces nothing?
It's more about over here, it's not that your action produces nothing, but it's more about like the impression that that creates on you isn't there. So it's a little different. It's not saying that you're not going to do any action.
Hmm.
And that's where the concept of kind of detachment plays in.
Right. Okay.
So in that, it's more of that sense. It's not that you're not going to have any action.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Sorry, I don't have an answer. I just had more questions,
Yeah,
but
no, no, of course, by all means. Does anybody else have anything else they want to share? Okay, perfect. So I think Sid's answer was pretty much right on the nail that both good and bad karma essentially do bind you. They do attach you. With bad karma, it's pretty obvious, right? That like, oh, like you're doing something bad, you're harming people, you're kind of in a way like isolating yourself from the rest of humanity. And even that in and of itself, you're like attaching yourself to the world in some way. But even with good karma, like if something good happens to you, then or something like you do something good or something good happens to you, it's like kind of natural or it's very easy as human nature to kind of like take that for granted and just assume that to be the case and get used to that in some way or form. So it's like creating an impression in your mind as well and creating a degree of attachment. So that's like your most average case where that's usually happening. So then the question is there any way to get free of this? Right? Like, if both good and bad karma bind you, then how should you act and why should you act? And that leads to the concept of karma yoga. So, karma yoga is basically the path of selfless action. And this is a verse from the Gita that sums it up very perfectly, that you have the right to perform your duty, but not to the fruits of your actions. So the whole concept is that you want to detach yourself from the outcomes of your actions. And there's ways to do that and practices that over a time will lead to that accumulation of that. But to start off, the key is not to renounce the action itself. So it's not that you want to not do action. You still need to do action. But rather than saying that I'm just going to do this only for me, it's to dedicate it towards essentially the greater good. So whether that be your higher self, the universe, society, whatever you may deem to be fit, but something that's kind of outside of you. And it's like a selfless offering. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily that you don't do anything that's good for you, that you just kind of like bleed yourself dry trying to fill up other people's cups. That's not really the intention over here. It's more of you want to do what's better for society as a whole. And that also actually does include what's good for you. That comes under that as well. Because taking care of yourself, kind of going to the example of like when they say in the airplane when those masks come down that you want to put your own mask on first before you put somebody help assist somebody put their mask on. It's the same concept over here as well, where that is actually part of the societal good. But then oftentimes we do take that a notch too much. So starting with this is going back to that whole thing of cause, right? It's never consider this verse talks about how you should never consider yourself the cause of the result of your actions and never be attached to not doing your duty. So let's think a little bit more about this. Never consider yourself to be the cause of your results of your actions, right? So usually when we do something and then something else happens, we associate that like, oh, we did that, right? This was something that we did. And in the practical world, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like it's natural for us to attach ourselves and saying that, oh, we did this. But maybe at a more spiritual level, that also leads to a certain degree of attachment and a certain degree of like, oh, I did this. So if something good happened, then, oh, I am so good. And that's kind of like the ego grasping onto your actions itself, right? Now, one thing that I found like a very illuminating example to describe this is there's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk by the name of Thich Nhat Hanh, and he actually just passed away a couple years ago. And he was very instrumental in bringing a lot of the mindfulness movement to the West. So one of the things that he talks about is that what essentially, when you say you, like something is happening, right? Like he gave the example of a sailor or like a pirate. So the pirate has a child, and that child growing up just sees the pirate do a lot of really bad things. Maybe he like robs people, steals them, kills them, etc., etc. And that's just the environment that that pirate's child was brought up in. Now, when the pirate gets older, then that or that pirate's child gets older, it's pretty likely that they'll probably take down the same path just because that's what they saw growing up and that's what's normalized to them in some way or form. So is that really the pirate's fault or that pirate kid's fault that they turned out that way? Versus is that kind of like more of a circumstantial thing that's kind of there as well? So kind of in that respect, then uh, okay. So kind of in that respect, that then because there's all these circumstances that are kind of at play, those circumstances kind of apply for good and for bad, right? So if there's good things or something that you're like let's say I say that, oh, I can feel very proud that I don't know, like living in New York City, I'm working my job, doing whatever. But if I look back at the circumstances that allowed me to be this, I was very lucky to be born in the family that I was. I was extremely lucky in terms of the education I got, or even at like a like for example, like the emphasis my parents put on studying and all these other things. So I had so many circumstances that were purely in my favor that allowed me to then reach this point where I am now in the position that I am. And for that reason, then should I really consider myself at a spiritual level the cause of my actions and take pride in that? That's kind of where this reflection, or this is where what this verse is essentially talking about. So I'm going to give a little breakdown of what it means, what detached action looks like by talking about an average action with and without karma yoga. So starting with without karma yoga, let's say like you want something, you have this idea in your head that you want to do something, maybe you want to buy something, whatever else. Initially you will automatically start going into this thing how you need this, that this will impact your life in a certain way. All these stories kind of start to get built in your head where you start reflecting on this and like attaching a certain degree of importance to this, and in some sense you start getting attached to the concept or this narrative, this idea of like your life is going to be so much better with this thing. Then you naturally start working towards it. But as you're working towards it, and this happens all the time, if you're not getting the results that you want, you start getting a little bit restless. You start thinking, oh, should I continue doing this? Should I not do this? And then like there's all this like mental chatter essentially going on. And then there's two scenarios here, right? You can either get what you were aiming for, maybe it's a job, maybe it's something else, and then, as all of us know, there's a brief moment of excitement, and then the next want kind of comes along. So, whatever that brief moment of excitement was, it's just like a brief high, and then it's back to normal. So, over a long period of time, the things that we thought were like super, super important to us or super important for our happiness, just end up not being it, right? But in the case that we don't get it, then we just end up being frustrated, blaming ourselves, resenting, drawing all these random conclusions, or maybe living in this hypothetical that, like, oh, what if this happened? Right? That would be so good, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, kind of in this like dreamlike state. So, there's a lot of mental chatter in this and a lot of pain that's kind of a lot of pain and a lot of attachment that's caused from this. Right? So, with karma yoga, let's say you want something to get started off with. A desire isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? You ultimately want to be alive. That's a good thing to want to be alive. All these, there's so many different desires that are innately very good for you. And then you work towards it. So rather than building up these narratives in your mind that, oh, this is something that I need, you just objectively look at it. It's like, this is something that you want. So what is your responsibility to work towards that thing? And you work towards it with your focus, with your dedication, and you're not really looking at whether you're getting it or not. You're just focused very in the moment, very mindful, and just very into that actual action itself. And then either you get it, which is great, and then you can be very grateful for it without clinging on to it, or you don't get that, in which case there's a degree of acceptance because you're not attached to that outcome. It was something that you wanted and it didn't work out, and you're able to accept it. And as you realize that you don't own the results, you then move on. So the amount of mental chatter over here with karma yoga is naturally just a lot less. So I see. And then yeah, so let's give another scenario that I can think that kind of relates to this. Is something I heard someone talk about recently. Was Oh, sorry, Trent. Yes, go ahead. My bad. I forgot to check that.
No problem. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. Yeah, so what you're saying about karma yoga and kind of doing what you're doing as an end in itself versus always just trying to work towards an end.
Yes.
Um, I definitely think there's a lot of value in that in terms of like developing presence and also just right action, etc., all sorts of stuff, acceptance, whatever else. But at the same time, I'm curious how you would differentiate that from something where it's like doing work for work's sake. Where, for instance, if you have like someone who grew up as a farmer and they learned one way of planting potatoes, and they do that way for their entire life since they're not attached to the outcome, whereas someone else who's looking at the outcome and looking at the problem and is seeing, oh, hey, I'm trying to plant potatoes, whatever else, they come up with like a better way to do it.
Mhm.
I'm curious then, I guess, how karma yoga distinguishes itself from just invaluing so much the present and like the actual doing of the work itself, how it avoids falling into the trap of doing work for work's sake and basically just being less efficient or doing less of the duty that you should be doing in that case.
Yeah. So I think going back a little bit, so we talked a lot about dharma, right? And what your responsibility is. So karma yoga has to often do with like what the action that you have to do itself is something that you want to align with your dharma, with your ultimately your responsibility. So going back to the example that you had, if someone is a farmer and grew up a farmer and then they're just doing something a certain way, and let's say they're not getting the results that they're not getting it like certain results, it's it makes sense, or their responsibility would be in a sense to innovate and try to see what they can do better. So that is actually part of the responsibility. So it's just that like if let's say they try some new technique and that doesn't work, then they wouldn't be attached to that outcome. They wouldn't be like, oh shit, like I hate that this didn't work. I'm an idiot. I should have just not tried. I should have just stuck with the tried and tested methods. So it's not necessarily, it's more about like the result of the action itself and how attached you are to that, as opposed to the actual action itself. So the action itself, it just needs to be aligned with what is part of essentially your role in society. And then beyond that, it's like being detached from whatever comes as a result of that. So it's not rejecting your responsibility towards society. If anything, it's accepting that in full graciousness. It's doing what you need to do. But then if that doesn't materialize, then it's not being tied down to it, not being attached to it.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So as a part of right action and doing your dharma, it's not only that you're doing work and like being very dedicated and doing what you're doing for however long it takes, but also that you are doing it. There is an aspect of karma yoga which is tied to also the quality of your work. Like if you are trying your best as well,
Yes.
however that's defined by each individual. Okay, gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so it's definitely not just like mindless action where you're just doing the same thing like without any reflection, right? Because part of your responsibility is also to reflect and to adapt your actions accordingly, right? If you think about it, right? If you're, as it's mentioned over here, if you're dedicating your action to either your higher self, to the universe, to society, then you would want to give your best fruit forward. You would want to give your best effort into whatever action it is that you're doing. So, kind of aligned with that, then it makes sense that you would reflect on the nature of your actions as well, and again, try to improve.
Wait,
And
so
yeah,
just to like clarify,
yeah,
basically what you're saying is like you basically live your life as you normally would, where you try your best to achieve all the things you feel like you need to achieve, but you just don't have a sense of attachment to the result, where whether it goes good or bad, or whether like you succeed or fail, like you accept that as more of like a external circumstance that's like there's some factors that are just outside your control, and then you just continue doing whatever you can to optimize for whatever you want at that point.
yeah, exactly. So I think there's a component there where there's like you need to figure out what right action is. And then once you figured out your right action, then after that, it is just like doing that action and then not being attached to the outcome. So it's like putting your heart really into it and doing the best that you can. And then not being attached to whatever else the outcome or whatever the consequence of your action might be.
Got it. Thanks.
Of course. Okay. So now how to act according to karma yoga. This is kind of like literally what we just talked about, but you basically have a desire that's, let's say it aligns with your duty, with your dharma, it comes up. Then you realize that there's the overlap and you pursue that action. And as you're pursuing that action, you become fully engrossed in the action itself. So after that reflection, you become fully engrossed in the action. That's the mindfulness aspect of it. And then when you're done taking the action, when that thing is over, and let's say there's like an intermediary period between when that action is over and when you start to experience the result. Like, for example, you're applying to a job or something like that. You dedicate your effort and everything to society, to God, to the universe. And then when you receive the result that you tie to that action, you accept it as a reward from God. Um, in either way, right? So this is kind of that process that, like, again, it's not very, it's a little difficult to apply it initially, but as you continue to like practice and practice and practice, you naturally just get better and you get slowly start to detach yourself from the outcomes of your own actions. So the goal here being basically progress as opposed to perfection. Yeah. So this is another verse in the Gita that talks about it, that fighting for the sake of duty, treating alike happiness and distress, loss and gain, victory and defeat, fulfilling your responsibility in this way, you will never incur sin. And when it says you will never incur sin, that's essentially saying that you won't be incurring bad or good karma. You will just be detached from the outcome of your action. And hence, that's that concept of basically accumulating no karma. And this is like a slow process where you're essentially, the way that a lot of sages equivocate it to is kind of like purifying your conscious by action, by repeated detached action. So initially, like if we think about action itself, right? Most people, or a lot of action that we do is like, I want a certain result because it's good for me. And then I perform that action, right? As you start to practice karma yoga, it becomes a little bit more about, okay, this is something that helps me and then helps other people as well. So I should do this thing. So that's like kind of like a start to be a little bit of a mentality shift, right? And that becomes everything, including your day-to-day activities, right? And then as this becomes more and more perfected, the art of karma yoga, then it becomes more of like the reflection of why you're doing a certain action is because it is the right thing to do and it benefits all. So that's that whole thing I was talking about with the shift in viewpoint is like that cleansing of someone that practiced karma yoga. So that cleansing of their consciousness. So I think the question then arises is like, what do you have a duty towards? And because duty over here is obviously a very important part of determining your karma. So I want you to take maybe like a minute or so and just reflect on what you think your individual duties are. And then we'll maybe have like a couple of minutes just to discuss and talk about what that looks like for each one of us. Okay, cool. Does anyone have a certain duty that they want to share that they think that they have?
I could go.
Yeah.
Um, I was thinking of two duties. One is a duty towards taking care of your family, and the people around you. And then the next being some type of like maybe a duty to make the greatest impact on society that you can in a positive way.
Mhm. Yep, those are definitely duties that we have.
Yeah, that was a similar one for me as well. I had mentioned, yeah, basically providing a happy retirement for my parents, both through like my time and through money as well. And then also like another would be towards, yeah, giving back to the community. And then the third one I would say would be a duty to myself and to like keeping myself happy and upholding all my morals and virtues.
Yeah. And I think that duty towards yourself is a very important one as well, right? And that may take many different forms. That may take the form of like that classic putting off something that you like, that pleasure in the moment for that long-term benefit. That may be one of those things. It could be doing things that you don't want to do, or it could even be just doing things that like you may want to do as like a form of self-care that is good for you as well. So those are part of your duty as well. Again, kind of part of that like filling your own cup before you fill other people's cups as well. So that's definitely an important one there too. Thanks for sharing, Sankalp. Anybody else?
I think I'd also overlapped with kind of like the duty to want to make a change. Personally, I think to one of the other ones which had come up as kind of, I guess, a more general duty towards everyone is to grow and like to move towards truth in their individual and I guess collective dharma.
Hmm.
Um, just although it's kind of nebulous, but again, like the concept of growing and developing. Um, as well as then I think personally, at least I feel that in terms of like my duty and where I feel the most energy and like draw what really where my best work and actions are done. I find that a lot in leadership and communication. So for a personal duty in terms of like what I want to do in the world, I feel a lot of draw towards like being someone who helps lead and make these different changes that I want to see and developments and other things in the world.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I think there's an important thing there as well of like what your natural aptitudes are, right? Which you mentioned when you talked about like the whole leadership side of things and communication as being one of your strong suits. So that definitely is part of your own personal dharma as well, where it's like you want to understand where you're most well equipped to provide value in the world. So I think that's a very valuable insight. Thanks for sharing, Trent. I know Meng also posted something in the chat. Thanks for sharing, Meng. I appreciate and enjoy the chance to reflect, but feel too shy to share. That's all good. Um, but believe that everyone has a unique duty that they're especially equipped to contribute. That is 100% accurate. Thanks for sharing. Does anybody else have anything else they wanted to share?
No, I just want to ask, you, Rishi, what are your duties? What do you think?
My duties are?
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually one of the things I was thinking about when I was starting this course was so I had been obviously like reading up on Hindu philosophy and like all these different things over the course of maybe 3 or 4 years. And for me, it was like, how do I give back and how do I find my role? And I realized that my skill set wouldn't be to go and try to um just purely meditate in the mountains and then try to become some like a realized enlightened person. That was not necessarily given my responsibilities and all the other things in my life the right course of action. But I thought that where could I find a middle ground in something that I feel like I'm uniquely suited to contribute? And that's where I kind of came up with the idea of this itself. So even for me, if like if I was to ask myself why exactly am I building this course or doing this. It's very much oriented around the lines of I think this is something that's good for people as a whole. And I am uniquely equipped where I have naturally experience of living as a 20 something year old in North America, but then someone that also has taken the time to learn a little bit about this and like experience this through my day-to-day life. So that's for me, what my one of the things that was my duty. Definitely the family thing is another one that's of my duties as well, right? Making sure that my parents are taken care of and that they are given the support that they need, whether it's with retirement and all these other things. I feel like I also have a duty in terms of at a personal level, growing myself intellectually, growing the way that I think is super important to me. And I think that's something that like ties in both on a spiritual level and then on just like a more just like general knowledge based level. The more that I can upskill over a period of time, the more that I feel like I can contribute back to the world as well. And like it adds to the value that I provide to society. So that's one of those things as well. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of duties, but I'd say those are amongst my core duties. And then obviously taking care of my health and all these like individual personal duties are definitely there. So that would be my answer. I think there's one more chat there. Okay,
That
perfect.
was a great answer. That was a great answer.
Thank you. Did anybody else want to share anything? Okay, perfect. Let's get going. There's a couple more discussion questions we're gonna have, and then we're gonna go into meditation. So I thought just to make it a little easier, or just test ourselves a little bit, I came up with a few scenarios where we can then discuss a little bit of what karma yoga looks like, right? So here is like a very common scenario, right? Where like you feel like you deserve a promotion at work and you've been working really hard, but somebody else on your team gets a promotion, right? It's the questions that I have then are how do you act and how do you deal with the feelings of jealousy and disappointment? And what do you think is the right course of action in a scenario like this? And I'll give you like 30 seconds to think. Anyone have any initial thoughts? Yeah, Trent, go ahead.
Yeah, so I forgot the exact quote or exactly what he was saying, but a couple weeks ago, I'd finished reading A New Earth, which is a book by Eckhart Tolle, same guy who wrote Power of Now.
Yeah.
And in it, he included a very interesting conclusion where in these situations where you feel like you deserve something and then you see something else which someone else has, um, in those moments, it's so much your duty slash well, I guess responsibility, um, to really celebrate and invite that energy in seeing it in someone else, you invite it in yourself.
Hmm.
Um, where if you then are instead more closed off and pushing against like that happening to them getting promoted, then again, I forgot the exact reasoning, but it was very, it made a lot of sense that in pushing away kind of like that energy and happenings towards someone else, in rejecting that, you end up by proxy creating kind of like this negativity or bad karma, etc., that results in basically pushing away that thing from yourself as well.
Hmm. That makes a lot of sense. So there's a very big importance on how you initially deal with the reaction itself, right? So it's like rather than necessarily like maintaining that jealousy and feeding it, fueling it. It's like there's an element of almost like doing the opposite of what you're like naturally inclined to do, right? Where you want to celebrate that this other person has received a promotion. So it's like being happy and being grateful because something good is happening to someone. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Does anybody else have any other thoughts?
Something I've been trying to do. Oh wait, we need to turn down the volume. Okay, so something I try to do, which is kind of harder in practice, is I try to think it in terms of the other person. Like the fact that I didn't get the promotion means they got it. And then that might be really great for them or really exciting for them, which it can be hard to do in practice, but I try to think of things more in that way when stuff like that does happen.
Yeah. So putting yourself in the other shoes makes it much easier, like almost like a thing of compassion over there, right? Where it's like you put yourself in the other person's shoes and then you're happy for them. That's definitely a great way of dealing with it in that moment itself. For sure. Anybody else?
I think I can also offer a quick perspective, and I guess is that like that person has probably also worked very hard for the promotion. I guess in this scenario, it doesn't really state like if that person doesn't deserve it or not. And so I think it's important to see it that way as well. Like this person, I guess similar to as kind of what Rihanna said, like it's important to put yourself in those shoes as well. And because they also definitely think that they probably deserve the promotion, and it might be the same the other way around.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I guess I have a follow-up question. Dia, actually go ahead first.
Hi, yeah, I just basically wanted to talk about how I don't know what you think, Rishi, but you know this concept of like whatever's meant for you will happen kind of thing. So that's like also another phrase that people use in the sense of like wanting to detach. And
Hmm.
I feel like if I was that person in the scenario where I like was working really hard or working towards a goal of a promotion, someone else got it, like the couple things that would go in my mind is like maybe one, either like for example, the increase in workload that comes with the promotion wasn't meant for me.
Yeah,
Maybe I was not ready for like the jump ahead. Or if I was ready, then like maybe it's time for me to start looking elsewhere, whatever, or that like I can just enjoy my time being in this role, because that wasn't necessarily my path. So I guess like those are the kind of thoughts that come into your head, or I don't know if you agree with this, Rishi, but like I feel like that's the kind of stuff that's helped me like be less attached and just be happy exactly like with what my purpose is and what I'm doing. For example, like career is like an example of one of those duties you have. Like being like financially stable, supporting the people around you, is a duty, right? So just
yeah,
being accepting of the fact that like this wasn't meant for me at that time, but I still want to fulfill that duty and like there will be something that will show me the way to do that.
yeah. That's definitely valid, and I think that's a good way to detach as well, right? The acceptance of whatever is there is meant for you. But I think that also comes with a little bit of a caveat, right? That sometimes you don't want to avoid action hoping that something good will come for you. And I think there's a really good example that this Swami I recently visited, um, he was talking about, and it was a little bit of a different example, but like he was talking about, I think, between divine grace and your own effort, what causes an action, right? Is it your own effort, or is it like the grace and like everything else in the world, all that grace, the love, all that stuff that causes a certain outcome? And he gave the example of cutting a piece of paper with scissors. And he asked, does the top blade cut more of the paper, or does the bottom blade cut the paper? And obviously, it's like both of them cut. It's hard to like distinguish between both of them. So in a similar scenario, it's like I think with things like this, with acceptance, there also has to come that thing where it's like you are doing your right action, And then after that, you are grateful that of everything else and you can accept everything else. And that's when the things that are meant for you, that's when they come, right? So there has to be an element of action over there and then an element of detachment. And I think that kind of works similarly to that scenario of like the scissors cutting through a piece of paper. So yeah, that's a little bit of my opinion on it at least. But thanks for sharing, Dia. Also, just reading Meng Ming's comment, I think ideally I would want to be happy for the other person, but obviously would feel disappointed for myself. I think the ideal would be to tell myself it's okay to feel the difficult feelings and not fight them, but also feel proud of the work that we put in, regardless of the outcome. That makes a lot of sense. So I think all of us have very much talked about how to deal with the feelings of jealousy and disappointment. But I want to throw a little bit of a wrench here. What if that person wasn't deserving? What if they were just like they vied with the boss more and then they got the promotion? Or something else like that. What do you do then?
I think regardless, it's still more optimal to not be attached to the outcome and like accept the outcome as is. There's like a lot of variables in life that may not seem fair to you from your perspective, right? But even like for example, that skill of being able to like work in a corporate environment and form a bond with the manager, the boss, or whatever, right? Is a skill on its own. So
Yeah.
like I feel like the better perspective is it's not for you to judge like why things happen as they do. If you tried your best and you could learn from the situation,
Mm.
then really you already got from the situation like all you could, right? And like there's always an opportunity in the future to try again, but dwelling on the current outcome, even if it was like not in your favor or exactly what you wanted, is just only negative. It only would bring you down. And as we discussed, the whole like attachments to the world, it just creates more of that attachment and stickiness to like to the world and like bad karma essentially.
Mhm. That is definitely fair. But then a question I have for you is that if you just choose to detach and you don't act and you don't do anything different, then let's say there's another person in your scenario that's up for a promotion, but then your boss again favors someone that's just more of their favorite. Would you still view things in the same way? And that again, that may exist on a personal angle, but yeah, just curious.
Yeah.
Sid and then Trent.
Well, I'm not saying that we like do things the same way. I'm saying we still learn from them and like maybe adjust the strategy. Maybe the next strategy would be like learn the social skill of being able to like create those bonds with your manager, right?
Mhm.
Like I'm not saying you don't learn these things and implement these things the next time around. It's just more about not being caught up in, I guess, like a state of devastation because things didn't go your way. Or you can just like learn from it and implement in the future.
That's fair. Trent, I want you to go answer. Yes.
Yeah, so I definitely agree a lot with what Sid was saying there. If it's someone who, if like again, you're basically getting passed off up over because someone was exhibiting like social skills or other things. But I think when you posed the question, at least for me, what I thought of a lot was when you have situations where someone will elect just like their kid or whatever, where it's not like their kid is more sociable or no more gifted than you are. It's because they
Yeah.
have that basically nepotism tie.
Mhm.
And I think in that scenario, that's honestly a place for you to reflect. And as Sid had touched on, you never want to be in a place where you're just dwelling in anger and resentment because that's productive for no one.
Yeah.
So in there, that's an area for you to reflect and basically either be like, oh, okay, this sucks, but it doesn't actually impact what my goals are. Like, how much do I need this promotion, et cetera, whatever else, other stuff. Is it an issue? And if it's not an issue at its core, then just surrendering to it and fully accepting it,
Mhm.
I would say is then the best move there.
Mhm.
But if it is something where like your dharma, your goal, whatever else, is to get that promotion, to move to like these higher offices, etc., at whatever corporation. And if you learn that because of like who's in charge, etc., it's that you can't do that if someone's just consistently electing whatever, like their friends, etc., to their lifelong friends, their children, etc., to positions which you have no easy way to compete for or aren't on a level playing field. I also think it's entirely fair in that situation and good in that situation too to then be like, okay, if this is something I need, then it's also then on my part to then be like, all right, I'm going to move and look somewhere else at that point if that's truly something that I need. Because again, if it's a situation that you're okay with and
Mhm.
it's like annoying, but it's okay, then there's no point in holding resentment towards it. Or if it's a
Yeah.
situation that is unbearable and is, again, preventing you from achieving what you need to do, then
Mhm.
you let the situation go and move on towards what you need to do. Because there's no point in standing around in the situation when you being upset about the situation is not going to change the situation.
Yeah. So I think that's where it gets interesting, right? Because then now there's like when you get to a scenario where it's like very obviously unfair, then the one thing that I think that people also misunderstand a little bit that when it comes to the spiritual path is just because you are on the spiritual path and want to be more aware of these things doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be a pushover, right? And you can still be detached from the outcome of the action itself, right? You can be detached from, okay, this all happened. I was hoping to get a promotion. I didn't get a promotion. You can be detached from all of that and not have that ruin your life while you can still take the right action. And the right action in this scenario might be that, okay, this is clearly unfair. This manager is doing this quite a bit often. Maybe I should raise this up to another higher level. Or maybe you decide that I cannot do that because this job is very important for me. And like my personal financial thing kind of takes a little bit of precedence because I'm in a bad financial situation. So maybe that takes precedence then, right? Or maybe you decide that, you know what, maybe it's best then that for because I can't necessarily do anything to prevent this from happening, that I should move over to another team. So there is obviously the dealing with the emotional side of things, but I want to also bring emphasis to the necessity for action. So you can still be detached and you can still act as well. You can just act with that certain level of detachment and like not carry on to that resentment. Like resentment doesn't need to be the only motivation here for you to be like, oh, I'm gonna complain about this manager to somebody else or something. So that's just one thing that I wanted to bring to light with the scenario, and that's why I kind of brought about the scenario where it's like obviously our minds very naturally go to like, oh, we just need to be detached and we just need to like accept it fully, and that is true. But we also have to logically analyze and look at it and see if this is the right course of action for us or not, because that is actually part of our dharma in some way or form. So that's something that I would want you guys all to just think about a little bit as we continue on this.
I think that's a really good point. Like the idea that like you might still have to fight for what's right, which could be like an intense experience while still having the skill of being able to be detached from the outcome seems so like counterintuitive, but that is basically the exact message that is in the Gita when like that is given to Arjun in the whole like Mahabharata story, which I think that yeah, that's a really valid application of that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a very difficult skill to cultivate, right? Because again, it's very natural for us to like, okay, fine, if we just want to detach, then we just don't need to act. But I think even inaction in a scenario like this is a form of action. It's a form of the wrong action. So we do need to take the right action because otherwise, going back to that scenario of Arjuna and the Mahabharata, then Arjuna's role would be like if we were just thinking that oh, we Arjuna just needs to detach, then he could just detach and not partake in the war. But his responsibility was to partake in the war and also be detached from the outcome. That was just his responsibility in that scenario. So yeah, that's kind of exactly what I was getting at. Okay, the next scenario. So you have a friend that you've developed feelings for, and you're confused if you should tell them or not. And the question is, how should he act? And if they reject you, how do you detach from the emotional pain of rejection while still maintaining your authenticity? All right, Trent, go ahead.
I'm not sure exactly, I guess, how or which spiritual principles you would tie this into offhand, but at least when I'm thinking of that scenario, um, what I would do there is I would express honestly that those are my feelings
Mhm.
towards that person, because one of the things which I value in relationships is open and clear communication, such that both of us can make decisions, informed decisions, and have basically the freedom to choose and do as we like. And then the subsequent reaction, if they reject me or whatever else there, is dependent then on how they respond as well. Like, is it just them saying like, oh, okay, that's something like I just don't want to follow through on, but like we can still be friends. It's like, okay, is that something that works for me? And then I evaluate for myself. It's like, okay, yeah, sure, it does. Or maybe it's something where they're like, oh, don't, I don't feel comfortable with this, and like I can't continue in this relationship. And it's like, yeah, that's sad, and it would be upsetting, especially if it were a close friend. But at the end of the day, in terms of again being taking right action and being detached from the outcome, I know in my heart that what I did was right in communicating to them and being able to have the conversation and to give them the freedom to choose to not have me in their life is the best way I could see to value someone as well, and just offer again that honest communication and allowance for them to then do as they choose.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Does anybody else have any other opinions?
Trent summed it up pretty well.
Yeah. So I would agree right over there. So I think the one thing that I would want to like maybe even bring a like kind of equivocate over here is in this scenario, maybe I would argue that sharing what you are feeling internally is is a degree of honesty, right? You're not pretending, you're not hiding away some feelings that you have for that person, right? And honesty could be considered part of Sanatan Dharma, right? It's one of those things that upholds is like universally true. Like honesty is one of those values that everybody is kind of like has is responsible to holding up. So in that scenario, you sharing that information would be in most scenarios following your dharma because that's what your responsibility is in that situation. And then I think like if they reject you, dealing with the emotional pain and being authentic and all that, that ties in a lot with like the earlier discussion that we had in terms of like detaching from the outcome when it came to not getting that promotion, right? Where it is again at its core, it's a form of rejection and being detached and accepting and maybe putting yourself in the other person's shoes. All these different techniques are all very valuable in terms of that. But the how you act portion, I think, is very influenced by what your responsibility is. And I think in this situation, I would argue that the responsibility is to be honest. And again, very scenario dependent. I'm sure there's exceptions in this, but that was my argument when I came up with the scenario. Last one. So you're at a friend's party, and in an attempt to impress the group, you make some sort of sarcastic joke about someone's personal life. and it just does not land. The room goes silent, and the person does not like it, looks hurt, and you instantly regret your words. So, how would you take responsibility for your action? How do you manage the shame that you experience? And how would you move on even if this person doesn't forgive you? All right. Any thoughts? And maybe we could start by boiling this down with like, how do you take responsibility for your action? I think, or what is your responsibility in that scenario? What is the right action?
I guess first and foremost, the responsibility would be to like be like or be accountable and take responsibility for saying something that maybe you shouldn't have said
Mhm.
and apologizing to the person that you like whose feelings you might have hurt. So I think that's probably the first most important responsibility in that situation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, Sankalp.
Yeah, I'd follow that up by saying, like now that the mistake's been made, try to make it up the best I can. I don't know, like whether that may take, I don't know, some like extra efforts and like more work, but like it's necessary to maintain the relationship.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think Meng Meng shared here too. I think first instinct is I would message this person or talk to them privately to apologize and bury myself in a whole lot of embarrassment. Yes. So I think over here, obviously the apology is the key. And I think that is a personal responsibility, right? Where there is some pain that an action of yours has inflicted on somebody else. And so taking accountability for that is definitely important. Let's see, Rihanna said something as well. I think I'd apologize, then ask if they want me to apologize publicly as well. Nice. To make it right, and then deal with the embarrassment on my own. Yes, that makes sense. So now we're gonna talk about the second part, right? Which is a little bit of the shame, right? So then naturally, when you're in a scenario like that, then your mind kind of goes AWOL, right? It'll just be like, oh shit, like I'm so fucking stupid, this, that, like why did I say that? Why did I do this? Like everything. You start questioning everything. So how do you manage that shame? What do you think? Yes, friend.
Personally, with regards to shame and like feelings of like, how could I have done this, XYZ? Um, for me, in knowing that I can't undo it, and also in knowing that just staying kind of in a pit of shame in itself isn't really productive.
Mhm.
It's not it's not helping the other person if like I'm hurting and I'm embarrassed. It doesn't assist them. What I usually then focus on for me is, hey, I made this mistake, and now I'm going to try and figure out a system such that I can avoid making this mistake in the future. One example of this was when a while back, a couple of friends had come to pick me up, and they were trying to contact me on my phone via SMS, and um, my apartment has really bad. It's both my apartment and also my phone. It's a combination of them. But basically, what happened was my phone dropped like four of their calls, and I didn't get any of them. So I texted them like 15 minutes later. I was like, "Hey, are you guys still coming? Whatever." And they're like, "We've been trying to call you, blah blah blah, all this other stuff." Um, and that was somewhere where I felt really responsible and again really bad for it because like I just made these people who were going out of their way to take the time to pick me up wait 15 minutes. But where I could again instead kind of just go into a situation where it's all just like self-doubting and other stuff, which at least personally I did a lot when I was younger and don't feel like it really resulted in much productivity or productively. What I did there was I looked at the situation and saw it and was like, okay, this was bad. How do I avoid having this happen again? And in that particular scenario, it was like, okay, so the issue was is my SMS here. What I'm going to do, of course, I'm going to apologize to the person, but what I ended up doing personally was I ended up setting up my phone so it also now allows anyone who wants to reach me to ring me on Instagram because Instagram uses Wi-Fi to connect calls rather than SMS. So I figured out that system and a way to make sure that people could ring me. And I approached the person and had said, hey, I'm super sorry this happened. I really regret it that this did happen. And I'm sorry that, again, like you were forced to wait here and feel bad about it. Um, so since I know this is a situation which like I'm in with my apartment and like I have these issues with SMS, what I've done here is I've now tried to set up my Instagram such that you should be able to reach me regardless of like where I am, just because I'll always have data or Wi-Fi and you should always be able to call me. Would you mind trying to see if you can ring this and like, does this work for you?
Mhm.
And I think really there, not only just from the perspective of me having made the mistake and then offering a solution moving forward productively in terms of just lifting my own shame, it's also something which I think too is just such a more meaningful apology for the person receiving it, where it's not only, hey, I feel sorry, and now I'm going to just like feel bad that I made this mistake for XYZ amount of time, but also it's, hey, I feel sorry, and I'm going to take actual action, meaningful action to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think there's some pretty important points that you brought up there where I think you transitioned from your shame and you turned that and you pushed that into action. And it became more of like, how do I make sure that doesn't happen again? Instead of like, oh shit, I'm ruminating about this, right? Which is you exactly following what your responsibility was in that scenario, which is again very aligned with what Karma Yoga says. So that's something that I think is amazing. One other thing I want to bring people's attention to when it comes to this is going back to an earlier slide. Um, when we were talking about karma yoga and karma itself, there's the action, the consequence, and the intention. So even going back to your scenario or this scenario that I brought up, the intention is ultimately what in this framework determines the moral quality of the action, right? Perhaps even more so than the reaction of the other person. So if your intention was obviously in the right place, then there is then experiencing shame is not necessarily doing anything there. And what I've noticed, at least for myself, is that I found that I, in the past, tend to experience shame, especially if the other person I know isn't forgiving me. So it's like, I feel like I need to experience shame to kind of like force myself to like because the other person hasn't accepted whatever I've done or like forgiven me for it. So hence I need to keep on holding on to this thing as well. Hold on to this embarrassment, need to experience shame because it's very predicated on that other person's action. But that's not very much like a karma yoga approach if you think about it, right? If you think of what it means from karma yoga, it's determining that, okay, this scenario has happened, whether whatever my intention was, whatever was in that scenario, what can I do to amend it to the best of my ability? And then once you've done your action, then it's to detach from the outcome. So when it ties down to how do you manage your shame and how do you move on even if this person doesn't forgive you, then it's when it at least what I've been trying to implement to my life now is that I can figure out what's the best thing that I can do in this scenario to make it up to the other person. And I will try to do that. I will fulfill my responsibility. I'll do what it is in terms of avoiding doing whatever I can, similar to what Trent did, to prevent that from ever happening again. But then if the other person accepts that apology or feels that is valid or doesn't feel that is valid, that's something that then I am detaching myself from because I've done what my responsibility was in the scenario. Even though I am the person that did put them in that scenario essentially. So that's kind of like my perspective on this, or at least the karma yoga perspective, or my interpretation of that when it comes to that. But very open to hearing other people and what they think about that.
I agree entirely with your take there, Rishi. That's very much something which I think I do there as well, where if at the end of the day, when like I've done everything I can and also have offered to like even like talk to the person where it's like, hey, what can I do here? And if the person then responds, there's nothing I can do to fix what was already done wrong, then I think at that point they also just give you very much kind of like that karma yoga insight of that inevitably at the end of the day, when there's nothing more you can do to fix a situation or other stuff, then there's two things you can do. One is basically to sit in denial, resentment, shame, etc., over what is and wanting it to be something else, which is implicitly taking you out of the present and isn't leading to any productive action. Or conversely, you can just come to accept what is and see that it's not it's not necessarily desirable, but it's not something that can change. So there's no point in fighting it. And that's somewhere where, again, this connects to like all of Eckhart Tolle's writing, but surrender is really powerful there to be able to accept something bad when you cannot change it.
Yeah. Thea, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with like everything that everyone's saying. I think in some aspect, like all of these like situations that you brought up, situations where like you feel jealousy or anger, like rejection, like low self-esteem, shame, guilt, or like whatever it might be. When you have like a scenario like that, obviously there's a reason why you're feeling that like that. So it's a big event in your life and or a big moment in your year or whatever it might, doesn't need to be your life, but just something that's personally impacted you. So you should just take a moment to reflect, analyze, and that's part of your duty, basically, to see now why has this been bothering me, and is there a way I can take a step forward, change my direction to kind of avoid this and stay on the path of like fulfilling my purpose, basically. But beyond that, like you don't need to, I guess, in some sense, like force yourself to feel feelings. That's not part of your duty. Like, for example, like you mentioned, like you don't need to feel shame to feel better about a situation. Like, that's not helping you and that's not helping the other person. Um, or even, for example, like you don't need to. I like saw something online which was like, for example, like let's say you're in a partnership and something goes wrong. You don't need to feel that other person's feelings for them, for example. So just detaching from the situation. This can be relevant for like many scenarios, so I'm trying to make it like general.
Yeah.
But you know what I'm saying? Like even for example, with that job situation, like just being angry about it beyond, you know, just taking direction and understanding why that didn't happen for you and how you can move forward is not doing anything,
Mhm.
basically. So
Yeah.
like don't like get yourself hyper for no reason. Like find ways past that to detach because those emotions won't give you any benefit, basically.
Yeah. And I think that is 100% valid. And I think that is that karma yoga approach to it, right? So even if we go back to this scenario over here of like this slide where I kind of broke down what an action is or like a desire without and with karma yoga, and if we substitute that desire now with someone's forgiveness, so you want someone's forgiveness, you naturally build stories about how it impacts your life. You experience all this shame, etc., etc. You do what you have to, but then obviously you're restless about in that experience itself if you're going to get that if you're gonna get approval from them, can you finally get that almost that like that shit that now you can stop experiencing shame, right? And then either you get it, in which case, okay, fine, that's good. You give yourself that forgiveness that you want, or you don't get it, in which case there's all this frustration, self-blame, and you keep on torturing yourself for longer and longer periods of time. Versus with karma yoga, obviously you work towards it with focus and dedication, and you get it, in which case you're very thankful, or you don't get it, in which case there's acceptance and surrender. Surrender to the fact that this may not be something that you can achieve, and as a result, you just have to accept this and move on with your life. So that's something that I think we'll leave off on for today as a means of reflection. So yeah, that was my end of my part series on karma yoga itself. We'll be talking about another yoga tomorrow. But I appreciate everyone coming on. I know it is already 10:30, so if people need to drop off, that's fine. I might do a small meditation right now, just so that we can at least get some meditation before the end of the day. So if you want to stay on for that, by all means. And then if you have any other questions, by all means, please reach out either in the group chat or just message me individually. More than happy to answer any questions.